hello the world, hello the internet. I was just going to talk about constitutional reform. I wonder if you're interested. Please do hang around. You may find it interesting. You should know, of course, that a constitution is two things. It's a blueprint for the state. It's a blueprint for the structure and organization of the powers of the state. And it's also a contract between the citizens and the state. And if we're looking at constitutional reform, then it's a good point to look at the way in which the blueprint changes, or indeed the contract changes. And that's pretty much what we're going to look at here. We're going to focus on this one because it's much more interesting. But anyway, always in these instances, what we're looking for is a way in which we can find a structure or a framework for our analysis. And we're going to look at it in the way in which the Constitution gives form to the principles. That's going to be our blueprint. Now, you should remember what the principles of the Constitution are. They are parliamentary government, parliamentary sovereignty, the rule of law, unitary state, and constitutional monarchy, something about the EU, but I'm not going to go into that right now because who knows, that could have changed by the time you come to look at this. So we can look at the way in which the Constitution gives shape and form to these principles and look at the way in which that's changed. The other way we can look at it is the way in which it delivers a contract. And I'm thinking here particularly about democracy. To what extent does our Constitution deliver a democratic state? And of course, you'll know all of these from the Intelligence Economist, the Economist Intelligence Unit, And so this is the matrix that we're going to use for evaluating the contract. So if we're looking at the contract, we're going to look at the EIU. If we're looking at the blueprint, we're going to look at the principles. Now that possibly seems a bit abstract and a bit weird, but trust me, it will make sense by the time we get through this. And the chances of me getting through this in 15 minutes are fairly minimal, but we'll give it a go anyway. I like a challenge. We're going to start off by looking at the reforms 97 to 2010, and that, of course, is New Labour. And, of course, first up is devolution. Now, we can obviously see how this affected the blueprint. We have reform here of the unitary state. Worth pointing out at this point that it's an asymmetric settlement. In terms of contract, we can look at the same stuff from a slightly different angle. We can see a way in which, yes, we have an asymmetric outcome in which England is relatively underrepresented. So clearly, the effect of the constitutional reform has not been necessarily to make things better in that sense. England is now relatively underrepresented and it's still hanging out there. That hasn't changed. Functions of government, we can look at it two ways. On one hand, it's a good thing. We have increased subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a great word. It means moving decision-making as close to those affected as possible. In other words, kicking the decision-making down the tree. And increased subsidiarity should be a good thing in the principle of democracy. In terms of decision-making, there's no reason why decisions should be made in London that affect Scotland if they can be made in Edinburgh. So we move our decision-making as close to possible as those affected. That is the general principle of subsidiarity. That is a good thing as far as democracy is concerned. What is a bad thing, however, is that this has just made the West Lothian question all the more absurd and all the more pressing. They tried the eval, that didn't happen. And so we're right back where we were way back when. In fact, things are even worse because we've got Brown's bribe going through Parliament, more powers being devolved to Scotland. This outcome is just becoming increasingly asymmetric, and that is not a good thing. So in terms of devolution, we've had some reform, we haven't gone far enough, and what we've got right now is a fudge that nobody really likes. Let's look at the House of Lords reform, speaking of fudges that nobody really likes. Blueprint, we're looking at reform to the structure and organisation of parliamentary government. In terms of contract, we can look at the functions of government, the way in which that government is or is not democratic. And without a shadow of a doubt, the House of Lords reform gives Lords greater legitimacy, but it doesn't give it real democracy. We're still not democratic there. And indeed, what it's done is it has entrenched government power of patronage. So it's less egregious an affront to democracy than it was, but I'm not entirely convinced that the outcome isn't worse than it was going in. And you can talk about the way in which the House of Lords has been used as a dumping ground for favours and for so on. The ironic thing, of course, being that the House of Lords was perhaps much more effective a foil for the Blair government than the House of Commons, but that's something we can discuss in class. Constitutional Reform Act, one of my favourites. We're looking here at a blueprint. We're changing the nature of the application of the rule of law. We have a statutory basis now for the independence of the judiciary, and we've got a much reduced role for the government in the judiciary. Specifically, the Lord Chancellor's position has been transferred to the President of the Courts of England and Wales, and we've got an independent judicial appointments commission. All of these are very, very, very good things, and I'm very, very happy with the Constitutional Reform Act. Even on this side, I think it has changed our political culture. We have formal recognition of judicial independence, and we've got a much more solid footing for civil liberties, with an independent judiciary being a necessary component of the rule of law. And you can't really have civil liberties unless your rule of law is upheld, and you can't really uphold your rule of law unless you've got an independent judiciary. So this is a good thing. Hurrah for the Constitutional Reform Act. Human Rights Act, well, if it was 3 cheers for the Constitutional Reform Act, it's 2 cheers for the Human Rights Act. We do again have another reassertion of the rule of law. We have a clearer representation of our rights, and they are now upheld by statute law, and that is a good thing. Can I get neither? There we go. So that's a good thing, and I'm very happy with that. It also has an impact on parliamentary government, because it limits parliamentary sovereignty, not by the courts, remember, but rather by Parliament. Parliament has limited government's policy sovereignty, has restricted the range of things that that government can do. And again, in terms of contracts, civil liberties are now on a much more solid footing, and that has to be a good thing. These things are now actionable in UK courts, which means that redress is easier, and we have obligations both on Parliament and on government to respect those rights. Again, this has to be a good thing, and 3 cheers, 2 cheers, sorry, for the Human Rights Act. We retract 1 because it's still subject to the interference of government by trying to persuade Parliament to do things that it shouldn't do. But in that sense, at least we have the courts who can now try to uphold it as far as they possibly can. But I'm getting distracted. Freedom of Information Act. Now, this is a bitter disappointment. We do have a kind of limit on policy sovereignty. So yes, there's a sort of a restriction there as to what government can't do. Let me explain that. It's made it easier for you to access data about access the data is held. It's made it easier for you to access data that might be held on you by the state, by other organizations, but it's still very, very difficult to lift the veil of secrecy that clouds government. And certainly what we have here is cosmetic reform. The Freedom of Information Act does nothing to challenge the culture of secrecy behind which the government tends to operate. And we see that again with the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. Yes, bad things here. We have the use of statutory instruments which limited the effectiveness of parliamentary scrutiny. Very, very hard for government for Parliament to scrutinise this effectively, because a lot of what we've seen in regulation of investigatory powers has gone through statutory instruments. Civil liberties, this has reduced them. It has made it easier for people to pry into you. And of course, bear in mind that this is being revised again, and we're going to see a new charter in 2016. And one thing you can be absolutely certain of is that it will not be harder for government to prise into your email account. We have a massive ongoing expansion of the state surveillance of citizens, and the Human Rights Act has done nothing to stop it. Organisations other than police and security services now have access to your data, and Parliament was practically sidestepped. As I said earlier, this was all done by statutory instrument, or rather the expansion has been done through statutory instrument, and that's very, very hard for Parliament to challenge effectively. We will discuss this more in class. But what we can see here is the way in which the contract has been narrowed by the government. They have restricted our civil liberties. Freedom of Information Act, I think I've done this one already. Let's just get rid of that. And that brings us to the end of the larger reforms of the new Labour administration. We're now into 2010, we're into the Conservatives. I think, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important reform we've seen under the Conservatives has been to the royal prerogative. Now, this is all about parliamentary government. This is about the government being restricted. We're seeing real limits here to policy sovereignty. And we have formal recognition of parliamentary consent for the deployment of military force. Now, this started under Blair, but it reached its apotheosis under Cameron with his attempts to go to war in Syria in 2013. And I'll talk about that a little bit next. But this is a new constitutional convention. we are seeing a real limitation to the royal prerogative, and this is a game changer. We also have formal recognition of parliamentary ratification of significant treaties and international agreements. This is actually created by legislation. This is the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. Important, slightly abstruse, but yet you need to know that this has happened. This is real reform, and it's kind of important, and not many people know about it. What we're seeing here is a restriction to policy sovereignty, as I say, massively significant, and we saw it in Syria in 2013 and with IS in 2015. Happy to discuss those in class in more detail as and when we can. We also need to talk about the Wright Reforms. This was an attempt to redress the egregious infringement of parliamentary government by the government, and it didn't really work. What it was supposed to do was to rebalance that relationship. It established a backbench business committee. It gave greater teeth for select committees. Chairs of select committees were chosen by parliamentary elections, not whips. But it didn't really give parliamentary control of parliamentary business. And if you follow this particular link, you'll see that in great detail. Unfortunately, my computer is choosing not to follow that, but we can do so in class. Actually, let me try again. There we go. So let's just, yeah, I know, and this is a slamming indictment of the Wright report, and you can just read it there. And yeah, read that in your own time. But let's get back to the PowerPoint. So that's the Wright Reforms, the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Now, this is very, very, very important. What we see here is, again, slight change to the nature of the parliamentary government settlement. We fixed parliamentary sessions at 5 years. Everybody knows about that. What fewer people know about is that we've seen an increase in the threshold of confidence motions to 2/3. It used to be simply 50%. You just need to get one more vote. Now you need a 2/3 supermajority to trigger that confidence motion, to trigger the government's loss of confidence. Very, very important. Functions of government, as I said there, we have seen an increase in the power of government relative to Parliament, and that is essentially anti-democratic. Here's some more things that you should know about. We have equal recognition for gay rights. That's a good thing. We're looking at improved civil liberties. And in terms of political culture and political participation, the e-petitions are probably a good thing. Again, largely cosmetic, but sometimes it works, and we know that about the Hillsborough thing that happened 5 or 6 years ago. So that's good, and there's a little bit there about the Hillsborough debate and the technical aspects of the e-petition. Again, largely cosmetic, but certainly I think in terms of this, very, very significant. That's one example of Hillsborough debates, the e-petitions actually achieving something. Specific areas still to be tackled? Well, there's lots. As I mentioned earlier, we've got devolution. Brown's bribe created even more powers for Scotland, making that asymmetry of the devolution settlement even more pronounced. And of course, the West Lothian question still remains to be answered. Commons reform, well, the Wright Committee was largely ignored, and we saw that certainly with the debate or lack of over the European arrest warrant in 2014. Parliament does not have control of parliamentary business, and until that is addressed, parliamentary government will always be a distant dream. In terms of contract, a little bit here about voting reform, the Jenkins report being ignored completely. The Jenkins report called for a wholesale change to our electoral system, and recall. The version of recall that was passed in 2015 was a poor imitation of what we really wanted. It did nothing to redress the profound imbalance of power between the party and the constituent. A little bit on codification. To what extent was codification change things? The answer is not very much. I really don't have time to go into this in a huge amount of detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chuck this up there. You should read about it, think about it, and then we can come and look at it in class. And I do very much look forward to doing so. Some very, very important questions there. But remember, overall, codification is a red herring, and a red herring for those 4 reasons. Can't believe I managed to do that in 14 minutes and 37 seconds. See you in class.